Right guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we've got this McLaren 720S MSO Spidering with us. As you can see, we've got an engine on an engine stand. This engine is out of that car. The car originally came in for diagnostics because it had a low oil pressure warning light on the dash. Obviously that is never a good sign, especially not on a McLaren. So before we saw the car was in at a McLaren dealership and they've drained the engine oil and found white metal in the oil, which is never good. That's obviously a sign of something either broken or a metal component wearing out, which is either one is never good. Their solution to the problem was to install a brand new McLaren engine, which includes all the auxiliaries for around £40,000 plus install, which is a lot of money for something that might only be a minor issue. The plan is to strip it, see what's broken, see if we can repair it. Obviously it's just an engine, any engine can be rebuilt, and it should cost quite a lot less than £40,000 plus install. So first things first, inspect the top end, make sure the cam caps and everything have all survived. Usually if the engine has got low oil pressure, the top end is the first to fail, so we'll take the rocker covers off, see what we find. So after removing the rocker cover, we can see that there's some slight marks on the cam lobes. There's definitely been some sort of damage gone on there. I was expecting to see a lot more damage to the actual rocker arms, which is a common fault on the McLaren engines. But initial inspection, there's definitely signs of wear, but not too bad. See what we find on the other side. That's not good, is it? Right. So we've got some serious damage. So just by inspecting the top end, we've got damaged cams, damaged cylinder heads, because they can't be repaired, so the heads will need replacing. So just on initial inspection, the top end's pretty damaged. I suspect the oil pumps failed on this engine. We initially thought that it had been run low on oil, but after seeing that, I actually think it did have low oil pressure, like low. We need to inspect the bottom end to see if the bottom end's got any damage. Obviously we'll remove the oil pump, inspect the oil pump to see if the oil pump's still there. Like, it's not uncommon for the oil pumps to fail and the internals to shatter. We'll leave the top end for now because we know that's already damaged, so we need to look at the bottom end, inspect that and see where we stand with this engine basically, and see what can be repaired and what needs replacing. Yeah, that's not good. That's not good at all. For those who don't know, that's the oil pump drive. That should be attached to the shaft inside the oil pump. Yeah, that's dead. Wow. So that should be in there, spinning the pump, as you can see. So that's why it has zero oil pressure. Right, so we've removed the girdle from the engine, which is going to give us access to the crankshaft. So we can check the bottom end to make sure that the bottom end's not scrapped basically. Usually we'd wait for the heads and timing chains and stuff to be removed so then we can take the crank and everything out, but with the oil pump failing and the top end failure, I just wanted to look at the bottom end quickly and make sure that the whole bottom end won't scrap. Initial inspection, everything looks good, luckily, I don't know how. So we'll get the cylinder heads off and then we'll look at it closer. Right, so we've taken both cylinder heads off now. We've just got the bare block on the stand. We initially just checked the conrod bearings and the main bearings to see if there are any wear and any signs of copper. But once we've taken the actual cylinder heads off, we noticed that there's quite a bit of discrepancy between the height between the piston crown and the deck of the block. So we've taken some measurements, and there's quite a few pistons that don't seem to sit the same height when they're all at top dead centre. So these are supposed to be top dead centre at the minute, but that one's lower than that one. Which, that is, something's definitely not right there. So what we're going to do is going to take the girdle off again, and we're going to pull these pistons out so we can actually inspect the conrods. My guesses are that one of these conrods are actually bent, because you can visually see the difference between the height between that piston and that piston. So we're going to take them out, have a look at the rods, make sure they're actually straight, and then see what we find basically, because that's not right. So we have all the pistons and rods taken out of the block now. We've got them on the stand. The ones that we measured were cylinders 6 and 7. So after closer inspection, that is number 7. It's got a huge bend in it. The one next to it seemed to sit quite flush. As you can see, that one's straight. So it's got one bent rod on this bank, and on the other bank it has another bent rod. Right, so here we've got 2 pistons and rods. We've got the McLaren piston and rod, and we've got a 5-litre Mustang GT piston and rod. So they're both out of V8s. Obviously you can see they look quite different. So the problem with these rods isn't necessarily the strength of the rod. The reason that these rods bend is, so the rods are actually guided by the piston. So if you can see here on the Mustang conrod, see how it's got that space on the wrist pin? That's what centres the conrod when it's going up and down. Whereas on the McLaren one, no space on the wrist pin. So the piston's made to fill that space. The problem with that is, on the conrod journal, the actual conrods have space on the journal. So when the rod is going up and down like that, obviously this car's tuned, it's got a max effort tune on it. We haven't tuned this car, but it's making a lot of power. And the problem with the way that these conrods work on the crank journal, they've got side to side movement. So usually the conrods would be butted up next to each other, so there's no side to side movement at all. But on these, the actual conrod can shift about a little bit. So if you start turning up the power and you tune them in a way where the torque and boost onset is really aggressive, the actual conrod can shift. So as the piston comes back down, all it takes is for the conrod to shift over to the right or shift over to the left, and you end up with a rod that looks like that. So the piston guided rods originated from the McLaren race engines. That technology is then transferred into the road cars. That technology is all well and good on a standard power engine, but when you start turning the power up, it starts to become an issue, as we've just seen. So the crankshaft has 2 individual oil squirters on the bottom of each conrod, and that is directly in the middle of the conrod bearing. So the oil pressure that's being fed into the bearing should keep the conrod rotating straight on the crank. With that in mind, the oil pressure needs to be high to be able to keep the rod as straight as possible. Obviously more pressure on that conrod bearing will keep the rod moving in a straight line. Less pressure, there's more chance of the conrod shifting side to side on the conrod journal. So with that in mind, the way that we tune these vehicles, we keep the boost very linear. So as the RPMs increase, the boost pressure increases. The turbos and engine setup on this car is efficient enough to make maximum boost pressure at 3,000 RPM if you wanted to. These cars rev out to over 8,000 RPM. The problem with a very strong boost onset is you're creating a lot of torque, but you're still running quite low oil pressure, between 2,000 and 3,000 RPM. You're not actually getting to the maximum oil pressure of the system. So if the boost comes in hard and you've got low oil pressure, well, not low, but lower than maximum oil pressure, that really makes the possibilities of the rod moving around a lot higher. So that's why we always tune these cars so the boost is very linear. One thing to add, this car isn't tuned by us. This car is tuned by another company, and it is a very fast car, but is it really worth having multiple bent con rods? So now that the engine's fully stripped, we've formulated a plan to get this engine back up and running. So obviously the main issue on this engine is the bent con rods. So we're going to be replacing them with some forged con rods with some new bearings. The actual pistons in the 720S are a forged piston from stock, and for the customer's power requirements, those pistons will do totally fine. So this new rod and the stock 720S piston combination will happily do 12 to 1300 wheel horsepower, which is more than enough. The block is going to be going to the machine shop for a light hone on the liners. Crank is all good. Obviously this engine suffered from a broken oil pump. Luckily it got away with no bearing failure. So the oil pump failing and the bent con rods are two separate issues. The oil pump obviously failed, that's just a failure, but the rods is something that's been happening over time when this car's being used and the actual tune that's on it. So we wasn't expecting to see that. That's just something totally new. We were expecting to see the oil pump because it had an oil pressure issue, but then when we stripped it and found that was a completely different issue. That has just hit us by surprise. The cylinder heads can be repaired, so we're going to be having some material welded onto the cylinder heads, and then the actual cam journals will be getting line bored and honed, ready to take a set of new camshafts. And then it's a case of getting gasket kits and all the other necessary bits from McLaren to start reassembling this engine. So that being said, that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll be assembling this engine, getting it all built back up, installed back into the car and onto the dyno for some hard testing. So if you like this video, make sure you like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.